Alright, here's my deck for Azorius Control in PD Season 33. So basically this is the same deck since Season 25, except the major difference is that you don't actually want to go to a super late game, you just want to kill them with Trawler. Because we have hardly any card advantage spells, and the counter spells are not very good in the late game, you really just want to end the game with either Trawler or Approach of the Second Sun. So this list is playing 4 Mystic Gate, which I think is correct. This is the best duel in the format. Basically, sometimes you really want 3 white sources in a turn, or you want to cast, say, a Wrath off 3 islands in a duel, and Mystic Gate is just really good at getting you an extra white source. Otherwise, it's just an untapped duel that isn't a duel on turn 1, which is exactly what you want. I mean, that's better than every other duel in the format, so that is why it's a 4 of. Glacial Fortress is worse, but you want more than 4, so there's a couple extra of those. I'm playing 4 Irrigated Farmland. I don't think this is necessary, but it's very easy to get flooded, because, and also just run out of value, which is why you want some of your lands to cycle. I don't think being a tap land is a very big downside. There's no cost to playing a tap land on turn 1 if you don't have an untapped white source, because there's no blue turn 1 plays, you never want to play Path on turn 1, and you never really want to play Condemn either. It's mostly just Inspector. Study and Castle of Vantress. Castle of Vantress is basically a better island, and both of these are here because there's hardly any card advantage. There are no fact or fiction effects in the format that are very good. I mean, it's possible that I should be playing the bargain one, but I don't think that's the case. They're all pretty bad, except for like Dig Through Time and some others that you can't really play 4 of. And Deduce is not an actual fact or fiction, so you really want to be playing lands that give you some amount of value. Castle Vantress is really good in a top deck war, and Study is good when you have more cards in hand, and you're kind of playing a late game against a control deck where you're not actually empty on cards in hand. You actually like to scry more when you don't have cards in hand, and you like to draw more when you do have cards in hand. I think Study is kind of bad, and maybe should just not be in the deck. Vantress should definitely be in the deck, because I think Scry is better than the Investigate, and being an island that isn't typed is better than being a tap duel. Colonnade is a 1 of. I think it would be more than a 1 of, but you never actually pressure people with it really. It's mostly there because you can run out of win cons if they answer your trawlers. Removal. So it's basically just these 5 plus repeal for the single target removal. Path is not very good in my opinion. I do play Novice Inspector because of it. Basically it means that, well, against aggro you want to both block with Novice Inspector and hit their creatures with Path. And against control you want to do neither of those things, so you just Path your Inspector. Condemn is otherwise the best removal spell, and Torn Lockpill is similar, but you don't want all of these. You don't want all of your removal spells to be on attacking creatures, because some creatures don't need to attack to be threatening. So we have some Paths, some Condemns. For card advantage, Search for Kanta is normally a 1 of, but I really like 2 because you really want to draw this. You are probably not going to win late games unless you have an Escanta, or your opponent doesn't have any kind of card advantage, but basically this deck doesn't have very much card advantage, and you really like the infinite card advantage from the backside. The front side is also pretty relevant for just giving you non-lands. Deduce is kind of like Hieroglyphic Illumination, where it's a cantrip that can also be a divination, except it's always a divination even when you use it a cantrip. I don't love this card, but since we don't have cards like Behold the Multiverse and Fact or Fiction, I do think you want it as a 4 of, since it just doesn't have much competition for card advantage. I think it's better than cards like Witching Well. Dig Through Time is amazing, but you can't play more than 2. You could play 1, but I think you really want as many card advantage spells as possible. So you really want 2 of these. It's fine to cast at 4 mana too. A 4 mana look at the top 7 is above rate. For a Fact or Fiction effect, like it's better than any card you could actually put in your deck, and you would absolutely play 4 of these if they were always 4 mana. Thassa's, basically I guess I should talk about that when I talk about counter spells. Jace, not really card advantage, but wins the game against control if they can't answer him, and is good at stalling against aggro. And you sometimes just use a -2 against midrange. If they don't have a board, you can use it again. Counter spells. So there are 7 plus 2 counter spells in this deck. Normalize and Out of Air are the 2 mana counter spells. They're both kind of bad in the late game. Well, Out of Air kind of. Normalize does drop off, but it's the only thing that counters everything early. And you kind of have to play it if you want to be able to counter non-creature spells. Out of Air, you kind of need some amount of hard counter spells for like control decks. And 4 mana is a lot, but it's not that much in the super late game, and in the early game you just want to hit creatures. And most decks don't really play many non-creature spells. You mostly just want to counter creatures in this meta anyway. So I think Out of Air is pretty good, and about the same level as Normalize. Only 1 Absorb, because I don't like 3 mana counter spells. I think the meta is pretty fast, and Absorb is bad against fast decks, or any 3 mana counter is. Which is why I'm playing 2 Thassas, so you don't really have to play that many counter spells. Because 7 is not enough counter spells, but 9 is. So you can kind of play 9 counter spells while also playing 7 against decks that counter spells are bad against. Like aggro. But like, you don't really want card advantage against aggro anyway, but you do need some kind of card advantage. It was kind of nice to have this, game 1, as your card advantage, because it's still better than a counter spell. Ravs, you don't need to split Ravs because there isn't a Meddling Mage effect, as far as I know of. It's just Lost Legacy, which they aren't going to use on your Wrath, or they shouldn't. Fumigate, because if you draw 1 of each, really the only downside of Fumigate is that you can't play it on turn 4, and if you already have a Wrath that you can play on turn 4, it's kind of just better. It's not just better, but I think it is better outside of turn 4. Trawler, the main card of the deck. Basically, the deck is built around stalling until you can get to Trawler. Or Approach. These are kind of interchangeable. It's just that Trawler is better against decks that can't answer it, and Approach is better against decks that can answer Trawler. They both kind of fall apart against decks with counter spells, but you do just play an actual control game against counterspell decks and you don't really fear running out of value too much because the other blue decks also suffer from that. So the sideboard approach is the alternate Trawler, where it wins matches against decks like yours have and Control Mirrors, and kind of like random Creed piles. Basically it wins a lot of the bad matchups and makes them good, because basically it forces your opponent to win by turn 10 or they just lose. Ruined Halo I added recently, and I think it's a very good card in the deck. Against red deck wins, it hits Pop and whatever creature they have in the field. Against the Librarian Shackles deck, it's Stoic Sphinx, which is normally really hard to answer. Hits things from random aggro decks. Hits some random decks like the Gruul Through the Breach deck. It's Calibrated Blast from Oops All Lands. Basically just hits a lot of random things. Hits Goblin Bombardment from Aristocrats. I think this is a very good card for the sideboard. Heliod's Intervention is secretly one of the best cards in the format. Basically dealing with any number of artifacts and enchantments is a really good effect. And the Life In is also relevant against decks like Red Deck Wins and some other aggro decks where you can also use it to kill enchantments and artifacts. Wrath and Condemn for aggro decks. Basically Wrath just wins against humans, and that's already favored, but it's really popular, so why not play more? Condemn for aggro decks as well as like Aristocrats, some Tempo decks. Sometimes you just want more removal spells. And what else are you going to bring in when you're setting out all those counter spells? Sarah Lane Drake. Again, for red deck wins. I think it's one of the worst matchups for the deck. And I actually think it's favored for Azorius control, but the deck doesn't really have bad matchups, so you want to shore up for those almost even matchups. The reason, like normally you would expect Azorius control to beat Predict wins, like that's one of the better matchups, but the problem is you can't actually counter their burn spells, because this doesn't work after turn 4, and this is 4 mana to counter burn spells. So basically you can't counter burn, your entire strategy is resolve a trawler or an approach. And basically the rest of the deck is just stall until you get there. Sarah Lane Drake is really good at doing that. It does kind of have a problem with Keldon Megaliths, which has been played a lot recently. So that's really annoying, but it's still really good against red deck wins and basically just surviving the early game. Counterspell for the Control Mirror for Yorion decks, for the Librarian's deck, any random late game deck. Forbid is great at being another hard counter that can also be used multiple times, because before you only had 4 actual hard counters, maybe 6 if you count Thassa's. So that's Azorius control. I think the deck is favored into basically everything. The worst matchup was probably the Librarian Shackles deck, but that's probably favored and pretty hard to lose now that we have Rune Talo in the deck. It's probably now red deck wins. That is the worst matchup. Random greed piles could still be a problem if approach and trawler aren't fast enough to deal with them. But otherwise it's probably mono red, even though that's a favored matchup, I think. And then you can have problems like Aristocrats, I'm not sure about. Rune Talo and Heliod's deal with the bombardment. Sarah Lane Drake blocks pretty well, and just dropping a trawler does just win, so it's kind of like red deck wins, except you can deal with the reach easier. It is kind of hard to stop the creatures without a trawler though. You can really only stall them with the rats, since they're recursive. But yeah, I think Azorius Control is the best deck in the format. I am biased because I've done well with it, but the reason I played it is because I thought it is the best deck. So yeah, that's my Azorius Control deck.